Someone you love dies. You get a phone call. You take 3 days off work. You attend a ceremony in a room full of strangers. You watch someone you have never met say words. You hand the body over to professionals. You eat lunch with relatives you barely see. You go home. Within a week, you are back at the office. The average American funeral costs around $8,000, lasts about 3 days, and is run almost entirely by paid professionals. The average bereavement leave in the United States is 3 to 5 days. We have built an entire industry to handle the people we lose. But for 99% of human history, this didn't exist. No funeral homes, no coffins, no cemeteries, no paid mourners. For more than 400,000 years, the death of one person inside a small band of 30 to 50 humans was the most disruptive, sacred, and transformative event of an entire community. So, what did our ancestors actually do when someone died? Where did they put the body? And what did saying goodbye look like before there were even words for it? The answer is more tender, more violent, and more deeply human than you have ever imagined. Let's start with what no other animal does. Many animals notice death. Chimpanzee mothers will carry the bodies of their dead infants for days, sometimes weeks, refusing to let go, even as the body decays. Elephants visit the bones of their relatives years after they have died, touching the skulls with their trunks. Wolves howl over dead packmates. But none of them bury. None of them offer. None of them perform anything that could be called a funeral. Our species is the only one on Earth that has ever turned death into a ceremony. And the moment we started doing it is much older than most people guess. In the limestone hills of the Sierra de Atapuerca in northern Spain, there is a cave system with a narrow vertical shaft 13 meters deep called Sima de los Huesos, the pit of bones. Starting in the 1980s, a team led by the Spanish paleoanthropologist Juan Luis Arzuaga began excavating its floor. What they found, slowly, fragment by fragment, was the most important hominin burial site in the world. At the bottom of the shaft were the remains of 29 pre-Neanderthals who had lived and died there roughly 430,000 years ago. Most of them were adolescents and young adults. The bones were not scattered like animal remains. They had been deliberately deposited. And in 1998, the team found something extraordinary in the middle of the pit. A single stone tool. A handaxe carved from red quartzite, a type of rock that does not occur naturally anywhere near the site. It was beautifully crafted. It showed almost no signs of use. They named it Excalibur. Many archaeologists now believe that the tool was placed there as an offering for the dead. If they are right, Excalibur is the oldest known symbolic act in the entire history of our lineage. We were burying our dead before we were anatomically modern, before we had language, before we had art. The Neanderthals took it further. In 1960, the American archaeologist Ralph Selecki was finishing his final excavation season at Shanidar Cave, deep in the Zagros Mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan. Buried under a slab of limestone was the skeleton of a Neanderthal man, now known as Shanidar IV, who had died about 70,000 years ago. Selecki collected routine soil samples from around the body. 8 years later, the French palynologist Arlette Leroy-Gourhan analyzed the pollen they contained. What she found stopped the field cold. The soil around the body held entire clumps of pollen from yarrow, cornflower, grape hyacinth, and hollyhock. Those flowers did not grow inside the cave. They had been brought in. Leroy-Gourhan and Selecki argued that the Neanderthals had laid flowers on their dead. The discovery was controversial then, and it is still debated. But there is no longer any doubt about the larger pattern. Multiple Neanderthals at Shanidar were carefully placed into fetal positions, supported with stones, and deliberately buried. New excavations from 2018 to 2020 confirmed at least one more clearly intentional burial in the same cave. The Neanderthals grieved. They handled their dead with care, And whatever else they were not the brutes the cartoons made them. They lost people. They missed them. They carried that loss the same way we do, and they tried to do something about it. Then our own species, Homo sapiens, joined the story. On Mount Carmel, in what is now northern Israel, two caves named Kafsa and Skul preserve the oldest known burials of fully modern humans. The remains date back as far as 120,000 years. 15 individuals lay buried at Kafsa. Around them, archaeologists have recovered 71 pieces of red ochre and stone tools stained the same color. At Skul, 10 individuals were laid out, including 3 children, surrounded by naturally perforated shells with use-wear patterns showing they had been strung as necklaces. Some of the shells were dyed with ochre. The Kafsa shells alone have been dated to roughly 120,000 years ago. That makes them the oldest known burial jewelry on Earth. Before our species had pottery, agriculture, or language as we know it, we were painting our dead red and placing necklaces around their necks. The dead were not just disposed of, they were dressed for the journey. But here is where the story becomes almost impossible to believe. In 1955, on the outskirts of the Russian city of Vladimir, 200 kilometers east of Moscow, workers cutting clay for bricks hit human bones. The site, called Sungir, turned out to be a 34,000-year-old burial complex. In 1969, the excavators uncovered something that no one had ever seen before. A double grave. 2 children, an older boy and a younger boy, both about 10 and 12 years old, both with severe physical disabilities, had been laid head-to-head in a single pit. Around them was an extraordinary collection of grave goods. More than 10,000 beads, each one carved from mammoth ivory, 20 bracelets, 300 fox teeth drilled through and strung, 16 ivory spears, including several made from full mammoth tusks straightened into straight rods, using a technique modern engineers still cannot reproduce. Experimental archaeology has measured how long it took to carve a single Sungir bead, about 45 minutes. 10,000 beads multiplied by 45 minutes equals over 7,500 hours of work. A team of carvers spent months, possibly years, preparing this funeral. For 2 children, with disabilities, in an ice age. There is only one explanation. Those children mattered enormously to the people who buried them. The grave at Sungir is the clearest archaeological evidence in the world that even in a world of constant scarcity, our ancestors poured their hardest labor into honoring the people they had lost. They did not bury the strongest. They buried the smallest. They buried the ones who needed the most care while they were alive, and they kept caring for them after they were gone. And then, on the other side of the planet, we invented fire for the dead. In 1968, on the edge of a dry lake bed in the southwest of New South Wales, the Australian geologist Jim Bowler was studying ancient sand dunes when he saw fragments of human bone emerging from the ground. The remains belonged to a young woman who had died roughly 42,000 years ago. She is now called Mungo Lady. The way she had been treated was unlike anything older that had ever been found. Her body had been burned. Then her bones had been deliberately crushed. Then they had been burned a second time. Then they had been covered in red ochre, brought to the site from a source hundreds of kilometers away. This was not a quick disposal. It was a structured, multi-stage ritual that required tools, fire, planning, and a long journey for the pigment. Mungo Lady is the earliest cremation in the archaeological record of our species. 42,000 years ago, on a continent that modern humans had only just reached, somebody decided that some deaths required absolutely everything to stop. The fire was lit not to dispose of a body, but to send one home. And finally, we stopped letting them leave at all. 9,000 years ago, in the great proto-city of Çatalhöyük in central Turkey, the people who built the world's first dense human settlement did not bury their dead in cemeteries. They buried them inside their own houses. Under the floors of the rooms where the living slept, sometimes directly beneath the platforms where the family laid their heads at night. When a new person died, they dug into the existing burial space and added the body to the layered remains of the people who had come before. Children grew up sleeping inches above the bones of their great-grandmothers. The ancestors did not leave the family. They became the foundations of the house. The dead were not a separate population. They were the lower half of the village. For 99% of human history, the dead were the most important members of the community. We carved Excalibur in red quartzite and placed it in the bone pit at Atapuerca. We laid flowers on the chests of our Neanderthal cousins in Iraq. We painted our first Homo sapiens dead with ochre and strung shells around their necks in Israel. We spent 7,500 hours carving beads for 2 disabled boys in the Russian Ice Age. We burned, broke, burned again, and pigmented the body of a young woman in Australia. We laid our parents under the floor of our own bedrooms in Turkey and slept on top of them. The dead were not gone. They were never gone. They were in the walls. They were in the floor. They were in the smoke of the cremation fire. They were in the flowers of the next spring. We have replaced all of that with a phone call, a chapel, and 3 paid days off. Our ancestors spent 400,000 years inventing ways to keep the people they loved from disappearing. We have invented one very efficient way of forgetting them. And the loneliness we feel now is probably what they were always trying to keep us from feeling. They knew what we have forgotten, that a person you love does not really die until the last person who remembered them stops trying.